Welcome to CMES Conversations, a series of interviews with leading scholars and thinkers, hosted by the University of Denver's Center for Middle East Studies. Today, Associate Director Danny Postel speaks with Rafif Jouejati, the founder and director of FREE-Syria, an acronym for the Foundation to Restore Equality and Education in Syria. FREE-Syria is a civil society development and humanitarian support organization. Jouejati is also the English language spokeswoman for the local coordination committees in Syria, a grassroots network of nonviolent activists inside Syria. She was an executive committee member for the Day After Project, an international working group of Syrians representing a large spectrum of the country's opposition, engaged in an independent transitional planning dialogue. Jouejati is also a contributor to the book The Syria Dilemma, co-edited by Nader Hashemi and Danny Postel. In recent months, Jouejati has been traveling around the world to talk about the Syrian Freedom Charter, a national unity document inspired by the South African Freedom Charter, based on tens of thousands of face-to-face interviews with Syrians in every governorate of the country about what kind of society they want. Thank you for joining us on this episode of CMES Conversations.
Rafif, what a thrill to have you back in Denver. Welcome back and welcome to CMES Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
What I'd really like to talk to you about today is the Syrian Freedom Charter, which in many ways is a joint initiative of these two organizations that you've been principally involved with, the aforementioned LCCs, the Local Coordination Committees in Syria, and FREE-Syria, the NGO that you direct. The Freedom Charter, I'm going to just read the opening lines because I find them very inspiring. We, the people of Syria, from across her cities, towns, and villages, from across her diaspora, from our diverse backgrounds, ethnicities, and religious sects, women and men of Syria, affirm to ourselves and announce to the world our vision and dreams of a free nation, one that is devoid of oppression, ignorance, and discrimination. Rafif, tell us about the Freedom Charter of Syria. What was the inspiration for it, and what is its goal? What is it?
So I just want to clarify, Danny, that this was FREE-Syria with the LCCs, but also independent activists. I didn't want our project to be tainted by anyone who would say that it was one-directional. So we included independent activists who had no other political affiliations. The birth of the Freedom Charter came from different nonviolence workshops I had put on with different experts, and one of them was Dr. Howard Barrell, who was a key member of the African National Congress and who was a party to the South African Freedom Charter. And based on the vision that was presented to end apartheid, we felt that in Syria we needed a similar structure, a statement by the people, for the people, and the ultimate goal would be for the Freedom Charter to form the basis of the new Syrian constitution. Our goal is to disseminate the Freedom Charter as a statement of what Syrians want for their future to as wide an audience as possible. So this would include the Assad regime, key leadership structures within ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, the United States, the entire international community.
What does the Syrian Freedom Charter essentially reveal about the views of Syrians? Because the question, in a sense, that the Freedom Charter raises is, what do Syrians want?
That's exactly right. What do Syrians want? And what we found out is that what Syrians want is a unified country, indivisible. What Syrians want is a secular state where all religions are free to practice as they choose, a state where ethnicities are respected and encouraged to flourish, a state where...
The mosaic, the very rich, diverse
mosaic of Syria, a state where people can live in dignity and independence. So this is the vision of the Syrians we interviewed.
How did these interviews take place? We're talking about a humanitarian catastrophe, barrel bombs dropping, chlorine gas, fighting amongst various factions. This is a war-torn country going through one of the most unimaginable humanitarian nightmares of our lifetimes. How did the activists involved in this process get access to all of these Syrians to conduct these interviews?
That is perhaps one of the biggest accomplishments of this Freedom Charter, is that we were able to use 100 activists, more than 100 activists, who went around the country in every governorate, and they defied all kinds of fighting and threats and bombs. They were able to conduct face-to-face interviews in different neighborhoods, different governorates. They would conduct these face-to-face interviews and try to immediately upload the results where internet access was possible, and where it wasn't, they were able to save their results and upload later. In some cases, we had activists hand carry surveys back to Gaziantep, Turkey, where we had set up operations. It was extremely challenging for the activists to conduct these surveys because, first of all, from an Assad perspective, this is a gross act of civil disobedience, but also from some of the Islamist forces that were present. In many cases, we were told that if we didn't stop operations, we would be killed or detained. And so in some cases, we were forced to maneuver around those, and in some areas, actually stop completely.
Did any of those forces ever say specifically why they wanted these interviews stopped?
Well, with some of the Islamist brigades, because it is a freedom charter, or mithaq al-hurriya in Arabic, the word hurriya, or freedom, is very much frowned upon both by the Assad regime and the Islamist forces.
Very interesting and very revealing. When you were describing a moment ago, Rafif, the aspirations, the goals, and the vision that the Freedom Charter gives voice to, those aspirations of the Syrian people, it kind of brought me back to March 2011 when the Syrian uprising began, because the slogans of the uprising, that first 8 months or so of the uprising, what you described were pretty much what I recall being the slogans and the demands of those Syrians protesting nonviolently in cities and villages across the country for those first several months.
Absolutely. Freedom, dignity, democracy. Freedom, dignity, justice, because you are talking about a population that has suffered more than 50 years of Ba'athist rule. That many years of tyrannical oppression by a single family. And so when people took to the streets, at first they were really looking for long-promised reforms, but when those reforms failed to materialize and the regime began responding militarily, people wanted regime overthrow, regime collapse. But the overriding chant has always been freedom and dignity for Syria's civilian population.
I think those slogans have largely been forgotten in the world, partly because, of course, the uprising armed and took a different turn at the end of 2011. Not that the ideals themselves changed, but I think that the world's attention has shifted dramatically. And as a Syrian, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this. I mean, it seems that we're living in an age of Syria fatigue. It's hard to get people to read about Syria anymore, to follow the news about Syria. There's that glaze that's taken place, that kind of numbness to the sort of, this kind of what a lot of people, I think, perceive as just a deluge of horrific information and just all this bloodbath that seems to have no end in sight. So it must be a struggle to even get people to pay attention to the Syrian situation, let alone something that seems to fly in the face of the last 3 years, right? This Freedom Charter kind of brings us back, as I say, to that early stage with the ideals and the slogans and the visions of the original uprising.
Well, I would say perhaps outside of Syria, those slogans have been forgotten, but certainly inside Syria, this still drives what remains of civil society and what remains of civilian populations. Outside of Syria, perhaps there is some Syria fatigue. The numbers are absolutely paralyzing, and we need to continually remind people who are glazing over Syria that we're talking about more than 250,000 people who have been killed. We're talking about more than 200,000 political prisoners. We're talking about half a population that's been displaced or refugeed. We're talking about the worst humanitarian crisis of modern times. So this is something that we cannot simply glaze over, and it's something the world has to take responsibility for. This is part of our world today. Now, in terms of going back to the early days of the revolution, I think the Freedom Charter is very timely in that I think in Western narratives, Syrians are being lumped into either the Assad camp or the Islamist camp.
Right.
And the Freedom Charter really serves to state that, no, you're wrong. We want neither one. And I think in doing the surveys and in soliciting the opinions of Syrians, most of whom had never been given an opportunity to voice their opinions, we find that Syrians are wanting to rise above ISIS, above Assad, restore peace to their areas, and to live normal lives. At the end of the day, people want jobs, they want their families to be safe, they want their children to go to school, very much like any other population.
And they don't want to be abducted in the middle of the night by the police in what Human Rights Watch described. Mm-hmm. Human Rights Watch described Assad's police system and prison system as a torture archipelago.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely correct. Starting from early on in the revolution, I don't know if you remember reading about this or hearing about this, but many schools were transformed into detention centers. Sports complexes were torture centers. The Assad regime has systematically used torture as a means of quelling the population. And this began with Hafez the father, starting in 1969 and then throughout his reign. So this is very characteristic of the Syrian regime.
So the Freedom Charter, Rafif, really spells out a very clear and a very compelling vision of a future democratic Syria that would be non-sectarian. Mm-hmm. It would be a pluralistic Syria with civil liberties. Mm-hmm. What would you say to those critics who would suggest that this vision of Syria that goes back to the early slogans of the revolution and so forth, that this really represents kind of a small sliver of Syrian elite opinion, university-educated, urban-based Syrians, Syrians in the diaspora who, you know, have a certain kind of worldview that's a bit Western-oriented, cosmopolitan, but the real Syria, the majority of Syria, has a much more bloodthirsty, sectarian kind of worldview, which is why the first few months of the uprising gave way to a more sectarianized struggle. That's not my view, but as you know, there are critics out there who would say that that's really what the Syrian civil war is about, not these lofty ideals, but the bottom line.
Well, I would say to those critics, they don't know Syria as well as they think they know Syria. In terms of the Freedom Charter, this was anything but elitist. We deliberately did not pursue the more prominent Syrians within the opposition or within the context of the revolution. We deliberately went into communities that were being bombed and shelled. We went to the average person on the street. We tried to get equal representation from women and men. We went to average, ordinary citizens. We didn't ask them if they wanted the regime of Bashar al-Assad to collapse. We asked what they want.
So it's not what they're against, but
not
what they're for.
Exactly. We know what they don't want.
Right.
We want to know what they want. So that, I think, answers the elitist question. The other thing is that we traveled throughout the country.
Every governorate.
Every governorate. We never asked people what their religious or political background was, or ethnic background. The condition was that they be Syrian, and that was really it. We saw some very interesting results in collecting the data. More than half of the people we surveyed did not want to answer the question, what is your ethnicity? People would say, I am Syrian, and that's really the important thing. Almost 40% did not want to divulge their religious background. So I think that speaks to people who want to see a unified, sectarian-free country going forward in the future.
Just the opposite of the sectarianization process and the narrative. Yes,
absolutely.
So Rafif, in closing, what do you see as the implications of the Syrian Freedom Charter, which I think is just an absolutely momentous document? It's an extraordinary process that your team undertook. I mean, this is, I think, a game changer. This can really change the debate about Syria. But what does it mean for Syria moving forward? You mentioned a sort of prefiguration of a future Syrian constitution, but operationally, given the situation on the ground in Syria today, given the geopolitical equation in which, you know, many people see no end in sight to the violence and to the fighting, to the conflict, what role might the Syrian Freedom Charter play in the future of the country?
I think we need to extend extend the Freedom Charter so that we can collect the voices of even more Syrians. I think the Freedom Charter needs to be presented internationally to those political structures that are shaping the future of Syria. And I think the Charter is very important in the sense that it says what the people want. And I think all negotiations aside and all geopolitical considerations aside, we have to take into account what the people want. After all, this is what our revolution was about. It's about freedom, personal dignity of the Syrian citizen, and I think we restore that. So I think the Freedom Charter can be an influencer in the Syrian opposition and in the power structures that are currently fighting inside Syria.
Rafif, where can people find the actual text of the Freedom Charter and more information about it?
Yes, that's a great question, Danny. If people can go to our website, www.free-Syria-foundation.org.
If they don't remember all of that, they can just Google Free Syria.
Free Syria, and they'll find us. And in fact, on our website, they'll see the Freedom Charter Declaration and some of the other civil society initiatives we've been undertaking. So we hope people will support us.
Rafif, thank you so much for sharing this extremely important, I think really just momentous development that has come into shape in the form of the Freedom Charter. I think this is really just an amazing project, and I want to thank you for sharing your perspective on it.
Thank you, Danny. Thanks very much.